Hi, this is our pre-reading lecture for articles by Sanchez and Schrank. So we'll be talking about public art and mass culture in Los Angeles. And in order to do so, we're going to talk a little bit about the political and cultural context in the 1920s leading up to the Great Depression, both in LA and then more broadly in the United States. Then we'll talk about the role of public art in the New Deal, and then we'll talk a little bit about the cultural politics of LA in the 1930s. Okay. So when we're thinking about the period in the 1920s, we're seeing this era marked by tons of massive shifts in demographics. So this is reflected by internal migration of people leaving the American countryside and moving to cities, and likewise an era marked by lots and lots of immigration as well. We also see that the 20s are marked by an expansion of rights for some people, with white women gaining the right to vote in 1920. And additionally, we also see this kind of era marked by the kind of backlash to this growing modern, urban, and more diverse American population. So we begin to see the legislative action being taken sort of in response to this increasing diversity. So we see in 1924 a prohibition on all Asian immigration during this period. We also see hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan are also revived during this era. So it's a time of massive demographic and cultural change that is celebrated by some, denigrated by others, right? So it's kind of an internally conflicted era. And we're going to see how that plays out in Los Angeles specifically as well. This is also the time period in which we see the prohibition of alcohol happening as well. Okay. So in the 1920s here in Los Angeles is when we see the rise of Olvera Street and the area around La Plaza in downtown Los Angeles growing as a distinct Mexican and Mexican-American ethnic enclave. So ethnic enclave is the kind of term that is used for a neighborhood that that is shared by individuals who are from the same cultural background. So LA is a city of ethnic enclaves. If we think about Koreatown, Little Armenia, Little Bangladesh, Chinatown, Little Tokyo, etc. So when we're thinking about this idea of the ethnic enclave, and as you get into our chapter by Sanchez, keep in mind, what is the rationale behind developing an ethnic enclave? Why might an area like this take shape? What is appealing about moving to an ethnic enclave? And then what Sanchez gets us into is a consideration of what institutions are central to an ethnic enclave as well. So this is a great photo for us as well to take a look at Olvera Street and La Plaza in the 1920s as well. So LA is one of those cities that grows quite a bit during this era in the 1920s and grows more and more representative of, right, the kind of growing cultural power of the Mexican community as well. And that is what Sanchez gets into in his article. Okay. So as we are probably familiar with, the 20s were an era of economic growth that suddenly came to a screeching halt, right? So in the US, we see that the 20s were an era that was marked by big economic speculation. People assumed the stock market could only go up. And so there was a kind of recklessness in terms of the way people were investing money, and everyone was kind of ignoring the warning signs that the economy was beginning to slow down. So with this kind of really risky era of investment, we see this dramatic crash happening in 1929, and this is where we see, right, the beginning of the Great Depression, right? So the stock market crashes in 1929, and then this era of economic depression lasts for over a decade following the crash in 29. Okay, so in an effort to respond to the challenges of the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected president in 1933 with this promise of the New Deal, which we may be familiar with. So what we see happening here is that he's attempting to kind of get the United States back on track, right? So we've got double-digit unemployment, people are hungry, people are homeless, people are adrift. And so he's thinking about these three pillars that might help the United States bounce back from the Great Depression. So relief, recovery, and reform are the three things that he emphasizes. So relief in terms of like meeting literal needs of food and shelter and things of that nature. So relief for the unemployed and poor. Recovery of the economy to normal levels means creating programs like the Works Progress Administration and other forms of government employment that got unemployed people back to work. So if unemployed people have money in their pocket after having gotten a job from the government, they're able to stimulate the economy by becoming better consumers. That's part of the recovery aspect. And then reform. So reform of the financial system is a really big piece of this, and unfortunately it was the piece that didn't quite get accomplished in terms of a true reform of the financial system to avoid repeat recessions and depressions. Okay, so the WPA was the largest of these new organizations that come out of the New Deal and employed millions of individuals who are engaging in huge public works projects. So when we're thinking about public works, this relates to our conversation around public space and public resources. So this was an era, the largest in American history, in which we see the expansion of explicitly public building projects. So schools, libraries, post offices, parks, community centers, hospitals, all of that kind of stuff, right? And the kind of literal infrastructure like roads and bridges. And LA in particular was deeply impacted by this era of development. So for example, these are just a few of the projects across Los Angeles that we may be familiar with, from things as iconic as the Griffith Park Observatory, if any of us have ever driven up into the mountains, Angeles Crest Highways, and then if hopefully we get to go back to campus sometime in the near future, the C Building is a product of this era of public investment as well. So LA really benefits from this large federal works program, and the folks that were employed benefited as well, right? So this kind of idea of the win-win. So people are back to work doing significant and important work in terms of improving their local communities. Sounds like something that would be great in 2020. What a thought. Okay, so the other thing that's going on that's going to be important for understanding our article by Schrank is the development of federal investment in public art as well. So the Public Works of Art project is kind of part of this broader story of the New Deal. And art was viewed as this kind of important aspect to sustaining the American spirit during the Great Depression. It's the first time that we see the U.S. government investing in the arts. And so the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, they are sort of oriented towards this idea that art should belong to everybody. It shouldn't be tucked away in a museum for the elites. It should be present to everybody and part of everyday life. So they employed 4,000 artists and produced a lot of work, so over 35,000 works of art. And so artists were encouraged to paint particular kinds of paintings, right? Stuff that would uplift the American spirit during this era, putting forward an emphasis on, right, these American values of hard work, community, and optimism. So this project was actually inspired by similar projects happening in Mexico in the 1930s as well. So we see public art becoming a really crucial part of Mexican national identity. And this will be important as we begin to consider what Siqueiros offers to public art here in Los Angeles as well. So from his background working in post-revolutionary Mexico, the way that murals are understood working in the Mexican context is that they are intended to be tools of political and social engagement. So that's the kind of perspective that Siqueiros is bringing to the United States as he begins to work as a muralist here in the U.S. Okay. So these are some examples of WPA murals. These in specific are from San Francisco, from Coit Towers, from 1933. And as we can see here, these are, right, picturing America back at work, right? So if we're thinking about a nation that is experiencing double-digit unemployment, these images in some ways are comforting, and these are very idealized, as we know, depictions of the industrial and agricultural workplaces. Okay, and additionally, we also see the way that the federal government employed artists to make simple things like PSAs really beautiful, right? So this idea that every single surface of a flyer that you get in the mail should be emblazoned with something beautiful is again kind of adding to that idea that art should be part of everyday life. Okay, so when we're thinking about LA in the 1930s, LA is interested in sort of framing itself as this kind of rebranded cosmopolitan city. So they bid and successfully get the Olympics in 1932, and if we're familiar with what cities do when they are awarded with the contract to host the Olympics, a lot of things happen. A period of urban renewal, a period of rebranding, a period of displacement, a period of development often comes out of this era after having received the opportunity to host the Olympics. And so from the perspective of the kind of power brokers in City Hall, which we see here, which is also a project that was constructed in the 1930s, we begin to see that the city is being talked about as the city that is leaving behind its Spanish colonial and Mexican past and turning into this kind of city that is dominated by a white Protestant elite. So the conversation around LA's new identity in the 1930s is about framing the Spanish colonial and Mexican past as things that are valuable mostly as a tourist attraction, as opposed to recognizing the importance and power and contributions of the Mexican and Mexican American population in Los Angeles. Okay, so what we begin to see happening here around Olvera Street, and as we talked about earlier, and as you guys will read about in Sanchez's chapter, Olvera Street was a center for the cultural, political, commercial, and community life for the Mexican community throughout the teens, 20s, and 30s. And what we see happening here is that in the 30s, with this desire to kind of reframe LA as emerging from its Mexican or Pueblo past and turning into, right, this new white dominant future or white dominant present, we see this romantic conception of this kind of Spanish past being paired with the vilification of the Mexican community. And as you guys will note in a short piece from NPR that I'm going to have you all listen to, we begin to see the way that the Mexican community becomes a scapegoat during this period of economic hardship in the Great Depression as well. So there, what begins to be sort of part of the way the Mexican community is understood is being temporary or migrant, right? So when we know the implications of labeling a community as temporary or migrant, you don't value them as members of a voting bloc or members of a community. Okay, so what we also see happening is, as we know, Olvera Street and La Plaza are close to downtown, and there's increasing interest in this area on the part of developers and planners in City Hall who are attempting to rebrand Los Angeles. Okay, so what we see happening here in this era of urban renewal in the 1930s is this redevelopment of downtown LA into a tourist attraction. This probably sounds familiar because there's been a million different eras in which LA has attempted to do this in different ways. So what we see happening in the 30s is that an actual Mexican community is displaced in favor of building this commercial attraction that essentially reenacts the Mexican and Spanish colonial past, right? And so this kind of cycle of creative destruction that's part of this process of urban renewal plays out at Olvera Street. So what we're going to get with Sanchez is this discussion of what Olvera Street was and what it meant, and what we're going to get with Schrank is this kind of bastardization and this kind of displacement of an actual community in an effort to build a tourist attraction. Okay, and we'll talk about these tensions and contradictions when we get together for our Zoom meeting as well. Okay, so these are just some postcards that we'll spend a little bit of time talking about when we get together, how Olvera Street is being rebranded, right, a touch of old Mexico, little Mexico, things of that nature, and we'll talk about what is wrong with labeling Olvera Street as little Mexico or a touch of old Mexico. So we'll get into all of that when we get together. So then finally, as I mentioned, I'd like you all to listen to this short NPR piece before you get into our readings by Sanchez and Schrank, and then we'll spend a little bit of time connecting the political context to these aspects in culture and the arts that you all are reading about. Okay, that's it, and I will see you all in our Zoom meeting. Take care.